Hello, everyone. Just a quick first note. I'm keeping my video off for now because it is taking up, I think, a little bit more space when I do that, and we may end up with space issues as we upload these videos as the semester progresses. So try to save a little bit of space. So what we're going to talk about in these lectures that coincide with the readings and topics is going to kind of vary by week and vary by day. Sometimes we'll be looking at specific case studies like the book does. Sometimes they'll be related. Sometimes, as we are today, they'll be different. Sometimes they'll be a bit more topical, but that's to give you kind of just a little taste of the different things that we can look at to explore these subjects and to keep things kind of a little bit fresh. So we're not always doing kind of the same thing in these video lectures. So today's topic is sacred power. The examples that the book uses are Taoism, which we will talk about a little bit later in the semester as just kind of another case study, and Anselm on God, which are both very good examples for this, but there are plenty of other things that we can look at as well. Sacred power is a very broad topic. It does at times fall into the realm of kind of sacred power and kind of worldly politics, but we'll be talking about politics a bit more in depth later on in the semester. So kind of as a different example from the book, but one which I think is a very appropriate for this topic is the example of Shintoism. So what we're going to look at today is just kind of what Shinto and Shintoism is and how this specific religion relates to power. You will see that Shinto is quite different from most Western religions. It is even different than many Eastern religions. So it's kind of its own unique thing, which lets us kind of look at this topic in a little different way. At times, I'm just going to be explaining what Shinto is, but for your reflection later this week, please feel free to connect Shinto a bit more closely to the topics from the reading. So just to get started, what is Shinto? It is a term which develops relatively late, meaning that for a period of time, Shinto kind of existed without a name because it didn't need to be named. It was kind of the only religion existing in Japan, and today we use the term Shinto to refer to this religion, this longest lasting religion native to Japan. The word, if you break it down, Shin is the Japanese pronunciation of the Chinese same word, Shin, which means gods or deities, and To is the Japanese form of the word Tao. So you can see that connected to Taoism, which just means something like the way. So when you translate Shinto literally, it means the way of the gods. The term itself was finally used to name this native Japanese religion once Buddhism started infringing upon Japan, or started making its way into Japan, as a way to distinguish the two. So once there was another religion around, then Shinto needed a name to distinguish itself. And another way which locals and practitioners of Shinto, local Japanese people and practitioners of Shinto would refer to Shinto now and historically is Kami no Michi, which means the way of the kami. So what are the kami? This is a very, very broad category that we can connect to this idea of sacred power. The kami can kind of be anything unexplainable or anything powerful, anything extraordinary, anything which inspires awe, which is beyond human comprehension or beyond human control, and it is extremely broad. It usually refers to things like gods, spirits, so not necessarily gods, ancestor spirits, and things of that sort, but even also people, living people that possess power and some sort of special essence, which is seen as worthy of worship. But it can also be things like natural objects, so things like trees and mountains and rivers and rocks, and even animals. So this um, practice, this tradition of Shinto is interesting for us because it's hard to say that there is a belief in Shinto. There's no founder that we know of, and Shinto doesn't have a sacred book. We mentioned books being important when we think about Western religion last week. Shinto does not have a sacred book. The, the books or text which Shinto deems as important are from quite late in the big scheme of things. They date to the 8th and ninth century. The two primary ones are the Kojiki from 712 and the Nishan Shoki from 720. So let's look at an example here, which also kind of ties in with our topic for Wednesday this week of mythology. So you can think about this through that lens as well. It's hard to sometimes silo out topics in religious studies. Things blend together. But when we talk about creation in Shinto, we begin with generations of deities at the beginning of time, and these are called the Komi. And two of these deities stand out, Izanagi and Izanami, his wife, who bring the world out of kind of this period of chaos into a period of order. And what they do is they stand on this floating bridge, kind of in this primordial time period, in somewhere, kind of like a heaven, something that people in the West would refer to as a heaven. And they stick a jeweled spear into these waters that existed at the beginning of time. When they pull the spear back out of the water, the salt that drops off the spear is said to have formed the 8 islands of the Japanese archipelago. So creation in Shinto very much connected to Japan specifically. Later on, Izanami burns to death while she's bearing her child, who ends up becoming the fire god. Her husband, Izanagi, follows her into the underworld. And instead of kind of mourning about her, the story is much more focused on his horror when he sees her kind of decaying body. So he washes himself in a stream, ends up creating the sun goddess Amaterasu and the moon god Tsukiyomi, and also then ends up creating the storm god Susa no-o. This is important because one aspect of religion that is pretty common across the board is a focus on purity, and we see that here. Something like dead bodies is usually seen as something unclean or impure in many religious traditions. We see that here in Shinto as well. So as soon as Izanagi sees this dead body, he washes himself to purify himself. And these other gods end up created. And this storm god, Susanoo, is kind of a rabble rouser. He destroys the realm of Amaterasu, who is his sister. But Amaterasu is the sun goddess. She ends up scared of her brother. She hides away in a cave, and this plunges the world into darkness. This is very, very, very bad. All of the gods do all they can to get her to come out of the cave so the world has light again. And finally, the goddess Uzume succeeds. She comes out, or she ends up getting Amaterasu to emerge by doing some sort of like sexual dance, which makes everyone laugh. Susanoo, the storm god, is banished. There's a story where he eventually kind of battles or does battle with some sort of giant serpent, and he defeats this serpent with a sword. Now we can get back to kind of a very clear aspect of power here. This sword becomes part of the Japanese imperial regalia. We'll come back to that. Susanoo gives the sword to Amaterasu, and later on, Ninigi, the grandson of Amaterasu, becomes the ruler of Japan. Eventually, Ninigi's grandson, Jimmu, who is a human, becomes the first Japanese emperor and is given the three imperial symbols of regalia, including this sword. This is said to have occurred in the year 660 BCE, and supposedly the imperial line of Japan has been uninterrupted ever since. So every emperor of Japan can be traced back to Jimmu, and by extension, traced back to the gods. So all of the Japanese emperors are descended from the gods. So how can we kind of summarize Shinto beliefs? First, that Japan was divinely created. We saw that with the water dripping off the spear. A focus on fertility and purification. We saw that with the cleansing after seeing the deceased body of his wife. There is a focus on feminine aspects of life. You may notice that a lot of these deities, important ones like the sun goddess Amaterasu, who is the direct ancestor of these Japanese emperors, is a female. Interestingly, there is a lack of ethical teaching, so a lack of focus on morality, which is weird. We saw morality as a key definition with many, a key aspect of many definitions of religion last week. We also see a lack of ideas or thoughts about good and evil in Shintoism, which is quite strange from a Western mindset. And very importantly, we see the divinity of the imperial line. So let's talk about some of these things a little bit more closely. Japan, divinely created. So there is a focus on this relationship between Japan and these kami, these mysterious powers of nature and of humans and divinity in our world. Many spirits of deceased individuals and other supernatural beings are considered kami, but lots of people, as we've said, are also kami, such as in particularly rulers, your own familial ancestors, as well as extraordinary people who are still alive. Within Shinto, there are as many as 8 million kami. So there are lots of these, and we'll talk about them a bit more as we go on. Most of them are good, kind, they offer protection, and they are worshipped. Others are not so good, they're evil, but they're still given worship to kind of placate them so they don't bring evil into our world. That's those are kind of the ways that the divine beings and humans break down. But we also have seen that nature is a major aspect of, or nature is something where the kami present themselves as well. Nature is the expression of the divine. Okay. Then we've talked about fertility and purification. So in a little bit more depth, fertilizing the land, which we've seen done in this creation story, and practitioners of Shinto have a fear of defilement. So purity is extremely, extremely important. Death, disease, and blood are the three most impure things, and this is something that's pretty common across the board in all religions that focus on aspects of purity. Even into recent times, there were individuals in Japanese society who dealt with these impure things. The Burakumin, known as a class of people called that we would translate into English as the untouchables, who dealt with these aspects. They did things like butchered animals, tanned skin, and dealt with deceased individuals as undertakers and funeral directors and things of that sort. They even traditionally lived in separate communities, so they didn't have to interact with other people and kind of defile them. They are not as ostracized today, but these aspects of religion very much impinge on day-to-day life. While they are not as ostracized today, this is very, very recent, and some of you may be familiar with the Yakuza, kind of famous criminal organization in Japan. Many of them come from this Barakuman background where they were seen as untouchables, and this was their way to kind of make their mark in society. We talked about femininity being important. The sun is a feminine aspect. Japanese society is, however, traditionally patriarchal, but the sun goddess is the ultimate ancestor from which all derive power. There were many female rulers throughout Japanese history up through the 10th century. There are also important religious figures or shamans who are women. In Shinto mythology, the mother of the first emperor, Jimmu, is very important. And there are other stories where female religious figures are extremely important. One of these, a story about the Emperor Sujin, who gains peace and prosperity through kind of the assistance of two female religious practitioners. We've talked about ethics and morality being absent in Shinto. So for instance, we saw that story with Izanagi, where there's nothing bad said about him abandoning his wife in the underworld. And there is nothing bad said about the storm god Susanoo for being kind of rambunctious and bringing about the loss of the sun. There is no supreme being or god who lays out ethical commands or prescriptions in Shinto, but that means that there is also no evil aspect. There's no radical evil in Shinto. So we have dichotomies, but they're not dichotomies like good and evil. They are things like fertile and infertile, most importantly, pure and impure, alongside pollution and defilement. That does not mean that Shintoism does not have an ethical background today. It does, but that is largely from interaction with other religions such as Buddhism and Confucianism, which we'll talk about later in the semester. And then importantly, for Shinto and for our topic really of sacred power, imperial authority. The imperial family has a divine origin, and this means that the emperor has not only religious power, but also political power. So let's now talk about, let's talk about kind of very briefly what Shinto looks like throughout history. Again, this is leading up more and more to our discussion of power. Shinto probably began as nature worship and a function of clan identity, with the miraculous happening in nature seen as some sort of solidarity with clan leaders. So they would identify with the kind of miraculous around them. And that eventually led to these aspects of nature, as well as clan leaders, to be kami. They were revered for their power, simply. Over time, beliefs come up beside this, the main beliefs being around the relationship between nature and humanity, and the nature between humans, so interhuman relationships. When we get to the medieval period, which we can date from about the 6th to the 13th century, Confucianism and Buddhism come into Japan. This is when those two major texts, the Kojiki and the Nihongi, are compiled. Confucianism and Buddhism come in around 538. Confucianism is the main one that provides a foundation for ethics to be introduced, while Buddhism gives some sort of discussion about suffering and death. So lots of religions have a major focus on death and the afterlife as part of their religious tradition. Shinto didn't have that. So Buddhism also brings that in. And by 604, the ethical aspects of Confucianism and the views on kind of death and suffering of Buddhism are integrated into Shinto. Because they were seen as things which were not a part of Shinto religion, they weren't seen as kind of threatening Shinto, so they were welcomed. Buddhism had initially been rejected because the Buddha was seen as a foreign kami. But over time, they kind of meld together, and Shinto kami become seen as the protectors of the Buddha, and the Buddha and other divine individuals in Buddhism become seen as the protectors of certain kami. So there is there's very much a give and take relationship between Buddhism and Shintoism. They get along very well at first. We even see Buddhist text being read at kami shrines, and Shinto kami being worshipped by Buddhists as bodhisattvas, a kind of divine designation in Buddhism. Buddhism and Shinto combine so much that there are new religious traditions which spring up, such as the Shugendo, these people who train high up in the mountains in aspects of healing and divination and exorcism. And these combinations of Shintoism, Buddhism, and Confucianism are the basis for the samurai code of conduct, which becomes extremely important, as the samurai are a very, very important class of individuals in Japan for quite a long period of time. This samurai code of conduct emphasizing the purity of the heart and the soul, a contempt for pain and death, and here we see it again, a loyalty to the ruler of Japan, the emperor. Modern Shinto, as we can classify it, begins around the late 1200s, following the unsuccessful Mongol invasions into Japan. This scared a lot of people in Japan, and because of that, there was an attempt to return to native beliefs and get rid of things that were seen as foreign, such as Buddhism and Confucianism. They doubled down on the superiority of Japan and on the divine status of the emperor, and even instituted a policy called Kokugako, which is a national learning, which was promoted mainly promoted starting in the 18th century, but started a bit earlier than that, to return to the original beliefs of Shinto and shed Buddhist and Confucianism. Now, here's where we can get even more into this aspect of sacred power as we go forward. There was a period of time where the emperors were still around, but they weren't really in control. But we see the emperors restored in 1868 after a period of military rule. And in 1870, they pronounced that the way of the kami, so Shinto, would be the way that the nation was ruled. They even said that every household had to enroll in a shrine of their local kami. Shinto funeral rites were used. Buddhism was completely separate from Shinto, and the emperor was again seen as a living kami. So a very, very important religious figure. Something interesting happens. The emperor was restored in 1868 because of a rebellion. And those who died in this rebellion, and then after this, all those who died in Japanese war were granted a shrine, and they all became kami. So if you died in battle for Japan, you became a divine being. And this tied in directly with Japanese imperial policy of the 18th and 19th century. The shrine itself was built in 1915, called the Meiji Shrine, named after the emperor and his wife who regained rule in this rebellion of 1868. And Shintoism was blamed for Japanese imperialism and for Japanese war because soldiers were seen to blindly follow the emperor for two reasons. First, the emperor is a living god. He is a kami. He is a descendant of the sun goddess, but also because they could become kami themselves if they died. And this got really, really interesting, particularly when it came to World War II. So I want us to watch now a short video about this shrine dedicated to these war dead.
取材じゃないんですね。取材。
大丈夫です。はい、すみません。ごめんなさい。Can't film. We are here at just past the entrance of the Yasukuni Shrine. As you could tell earlier, we were asked not to film inside. with the microphone on. And that's because this is an incredibly sensitive shrine, not just in Japan, but in world history. There are 2.5 million Japanese war dead enshrined here from the start of the Meiji era, when the emperor took back control of Japan, up until 1945, when the imperial system was forced into collapse. And it enshrines the loyalty to the emperor. It's a symbol less to war and more to straight loyalty to the imperial system. And it started in the Japanese Civil War, where the emperor was taking back control. And so the imperial system comes back into play, and the emperor now needs to sort of venerate those who gave their lives for him in this civil war. And so they do so with this shrine, Yasukuni. But as Japan's empire grows, just like with all empires, you sort of end up with a more complicated history, because as an empire expands and takes land, the people who are already in that land are, of course, going to see the expansion as troubling, as atrocious, as war. But you still enshrine them here. And so as World War II comes along, and the true atrocities begin to unfold, and we see over 1,000 war criminals enshrined here in Yasukuni, things start to change. The major reason things change is because the American government decides that the imperial system in Japan is over. And what's more, there's going to be a separation of church and state. Something I should note that I personally agree with. I don't mean to insinuate it was the wrong move, just that all things have consequences. And so this, once a state-run shrine, now has to become privately owned. So America gives them two options. They say, we're going to burn it to the ground, or alternatively, you can separate it from the state. And obviously, they choose the latter of the two. And in doing so, what America does is hands the keys to this important shrine of loyalty over to the ultra-nationalists of Japan. It's bought up by a corporation, a religious corporation, that flat out denies World War II atrocities. There's a museum here that I think is almost the core of this denialism in Japan, just right off of the Imperial Palace, this Yushikan, this museum here at Yasukuni. It denies fundamentally atrocious acts of World War II. It even denies that Japan started the war with the United States. It claims that the US goaded them into the war. It claims that they didn't have comfort women, hundreds of thousands of forced prostitutes. It claims that they did not massacre the civilians of Nanking. And all of that's, of course, untrue. But if you're on the losing end of a major war, and your entire society is shifted by foreign powers, in this case, the United States, it can be understandable, at least in a certain regard, to why they would do that, to why there would be this pushback against this idea that they were atrocious, that they committed these war crimes, that they don't have a right to venerate their war dead. And if you look at other countries, especially other countries that have won wars and therefore haven't been forced externally to change, you can see the exact same fights going on internally in those nations, with Confederate monuments in the United States, where some view it as ancestry, some view it as history, but others view it as the atrocity of their ancestry. And it's kind of the same here. Most Japanese do not agree with the war criminals being here. Most Japanese do not agree with the state having any connection to the shrine, and most Japanese do not agree with the ultra-nationalist right owning and controlling such an important shrine. And yet it's happening. Yet it's happening here. Yet it's happening in our countries. It's happening all over the world. And while this is certainly a unique place, if you look out.
We'll stop there because he pitches his channel for the rest of it, but a very good example of how religion and power get intertwined. I'll leave the sect Shinto part for now. We don't need to talk about this. So what I do want to talk about, though, to wrap up our discussion of Shinto today, is how Shinto is practiced. What do normal everyday people do? Well, One major aspect of Shinto is a focus on fertility rites. We've talked about this. I'm not going to show the videos on this one right now, but if you're interested, I can send you these links. You see a picture over here of the focus on phallic symbols and on female sex organs, which are commonly displayed in villages and are objects of worship because of the importance of agriculture. The ritual calendar of Shintoism focuses on these fertility ceremonies. One important one is the Kinensai, which is a ceremony held in early spring for a good harvest. And the fertility kami are paraded around. And this is at the time when they are thought to be in their shrine. So you can go ask them for a good harvest. Part of the ceremony is processing around with these deities and dancing while rice is planted at the beginning of the harvest season. We have another major fertility festival, the Nanami Matsuri, which is a harvest festival in the fall, the largest ritual in Japan. This is a ritual which is linked closely to the concept of divine kingship because the emperor is considered to be responsible for a good harvest and for the fertility of the land. The emperor presides over these ceremonies. And there's an additional ceremony connected to all of this called the Daijosai, which the new emperor performs in their first year ruling, where rice and wine are presented to the emperor by the kami at night. So the kami are bringing offerings to the emperor as a living kami, which is very interesting. Women are important in Shinto, as we've noted. There have been many powerful female figures. There are powerful feminine forces of nature. There are religious professionals in Shintoism who are female, such as the Miko, who are unmarried shrine attendants who have some sort of power to communicate with the deities, usually through dance and through ritual. They dance at important festivals. They work at the shrines, but while they are part of the clergy, they usually are subservient to the males serving in roles at the shrines. They do participate fully in rituals, but not as chief ritual leaders. This is likely due to purity issues such as menstruation, where blood is seen as something which defiles. However, the most important position at the most important shrine in Japan, the Grand Shrine of Ice, which is the home of the sun goddess, is the Saishu, a female who is a relative of the emperor. When it comes to actually practicing Shinto rites, there are 4 steps: purification, presentation, petition, and participation. Purification means just making sure you are clean, both physically and spiritually. We'll see how this looks in a moment. Presentation is presenting food or some sort of offering to the kami to show that you respect them. Third is pleading with them for help. Fourth is participating with others who are there in watching rituals, sharing drinks, getting souvenirs from the shrine. We'll see what all this looks like in a moment. There is a very common purification ritual called the harai, where a priest waves around a wand of a tree, a branch, or of paper over a person. Ritual bathing is very common. We see salt as purifying. So if you've ever watched sumo wrestling, you can look this up. They throw salt on the mat right before they start to make sure that it is pure. So you can see how Shinto makes its way into many aspects of life. So what is this shrine? Where do these kami live? What is this all about? This is where rituals happen. It's called the Jinja, which is the dwelling place of the kami. They can be all sorts of places. They can be natural places like waterfalls or trees or forest. They can be marked just by a pile of rocks or by a rope, but they are generally enclosed areas with some sort of simple built structure or several structures. And to enter these, you must be pure. You must have purified. You must have ritually bathed or something, but you also must be pure of mind because the shrine is a holy place. It's usually guarded by statues of animals, usually lions, but it can be other things. When you enter, you pass under a torii or a crossbar. We'll see what that looks like in a moment. Kind of 2 upright posts kind of an upside down field goal post in football or something like that, which is some sort of kind of protective guard against impurities and contaminants. And a lot of times there are multiple torii which form a tunnel at these shrines. So when you enter, you wash your hands and mouths to make sure that you are clean. And then there are two buildings usually, the Haiden and the Honden. The Haiden is where people like us, normal people, can go worship. It's the public one. It contains a kind of big rope that marks the boundaries of even more purity. What you do is you stand in front of the building and clap and then ring a bell to make sure the deity knows you are there. And then you can pray and offer things up, such as money or food. This is also where you can watch the priests perform normal ceremonies. And outside of this is a courtyard where there are like wooden tablets where you can write requests to the kami. There are paper fortunes, which you can wrap around tree branches and things of that sort. We'll see this in a moment. And then there is the Honden. This is the other building where the kami is thought to actually live. Only priests are able to enter here. And in this building, there is some sort of actual object called a shintai, which is thought to be the embodiment of the deity. This can be anything from a piece of paper to a sword to a tree branch or something like that. Priests are not allowed to look at it or touch it because it is something which is wholly pure and sacred. So let's see what it looks like to actually visit one of these shrines and practice Shinto.
Let's go pray. Let's go make a wish. Hey guys, welcome to the Japan Ghost channel. My name is Chika. I am wearing a kimono today. I am going to my first Hatsumode. So Hatsu means first, and Mode comes from Moderu, which means to worship at a shrine. And it's actually my first time doing Hatsumode, so it's actually my Hatsumode. And we are at Meiji Jingu. The kimono that I have on is of a pattern that you wear for New Year's called takarazukushi. So it has lots of motifs that represent good luck, engi ga ii, as I told you guys in my last video. Here is the main tori, the main gate. And I'm gonna go in there and wish for a great year. This is basically a gate that separates people from the gods. So before entering, you wanna take a bow and you wanna walk along the side rather than in the middle because the middle is God's path. I'm gonna take a bow. I'm in the sacred land. All right, we've got another gate. Take a nice bow and we're gonna enter. Now, go in. People usually go to Hatsumode, their first shrine visit of the year, on the first, second, third, fourth, the first 4 days of the new year. But I've decided to go a little later because it gets crazy crowded the first 4 days. I think this year they made a record of 3 million people at just this shrine at Meiji Jingu. So it's ridiculous. All right, so before we go and pray, you have to wash your hands at this place called Temizu. And there's a right way to do this. You don't just go in and wash it however you want. So I'll show you guys. Water is pretty cold, but you got to do this before you go in and pray. And you guys saw that I washed my left first, right, and then you take a little bit of water in your hand and you rinse your mouth. And then you're ready to go pray. So let's go. let's go pray. Let's go make a wish. I've got a goen dama. This is 5 yen. It's good to put one of these in because goen means good luck. There's a proper way to pray. So you bow twice, you clap twice, and then you bow once. You want to make sure when you clap your hands that you move your right hand slightly lower and then clap and then put it back. And that's how you do it at most Shinto shrines, and it's different if you go to a temple, and there's some variations depending on where you go. Okay, so you can't film, so I'm just gonna go do this. I prayed. Next, I'm gonna get an omikuji. If you've seen my other video, I talk about it, but it's basically a fortune or an oracle, and let's hope I get the best one. And you can usually get them for 100 yen. So here we go. We have the English one and the Japanese one. Let me get the English one for you guys so you understand, not because I can't read Japanese. You know that onomatopoeia, doki doki, means your heart's beating, you're nervous. It doesn't have my thing on here.
明治の道図は、いわゆる大吉とか中吉とか、そういうのがあって、お祭りが読まれた和歌が、ポエムが書いてあって、それを対して意味を、感じるというか。
So I got my omikuji, my fortune, and I was expecting to get, well, I wanted daikichi, but one of those, the 12 ranks or so that I explained about before. But at Meiji Jingu, you don't get a rank, you get a poem. And the poem, basically, there's different kinds of poems in there, and that kind of symbolizes what year is going to be. And so I'll read you guys my poem. Let's see. It says, if we falter in resolve just because the task is hard, no accomplishment can follow. It is the world's way. Emperor Meiji. I guess I have some trials and tribulations coming my way, but I won't give up, and I'll keep trying. Hi. Good luck charm for becoming a YouTuber. Every year you come and get a new charm, and then the next year when you get a new charm, you want to bring your old one, and they'll burn it for you. This is called an emma. As you'll see, there's lots of them around me, and you write a wish on this side, and then you hang it up and hope it comes true. My hands are freezing cold, so I could barely write, but I wrote, I wish all those around me that I love are happy and healthy, and I hope to make people around the world happy with my YouTube videos. January 16th, 2014. Kika. Hey. I had a very good Hatsumode. I hope you guys got to enjoy a little bit of it yourselves and understand.
So we can stop there, but that gives you a kind of good overview of what it's like to go to a Shinto shrine. Just to kind of start wrapping up here, the shrine, a very interesting thing about the main shrine, the grand shrine at Ice, the main sanctuary of the sun goddess and of the imperial family. Every 20 years, it is torn down and rebuilt to make sure that it is always pure, which is really, really interesting because that means it is always the oldest as well as the newest shrine in Japan. It's always built identically to the original one from about 690 or 700. The one that is up now is from 2013. The carpenters who build it are hereditary, so you have to be from a particular family to be the ones who build it. There are certain types of wood that are used. Only hand tools are allowed to be used. There's no metal used on it at all. The wood for the shrine is selected years in advance and paraded all around Japan so everyone can see it and touch it. There are also shrines in people's homes. So people have family shrines, so miniature shrines, um, usually for either the local deity or kami or the kami of your individual profession. And you can make daily prayers and offerings to the kami in your house. What's interesting then is that shrine visits are not necessarily considered religious acts. They are just kind of a part of daily life. There are some other rituals that are important to Shinto, such as the New Year ritual, the turning of the seasons, the Doll Festival, Boys' Day, the Star Festival, the Ghost Festival, and the Harvest Festival. But Shinto would not necessarily be considered a religion by all those who practice it. It is a religion in religious studies academic terms, but not necessarily a religion. It's more by its practitioners, just more of a way of life. Technically, now the divinity of the emperor and state-sponsored Shinto were abolished after World War II, but this is not really a reality. So I'll close on that note as you think about sacred power or power in general and its connection to religion. Thank you.